All right, so thank you all so much for joining us for webinar number 4 out of 5 for Crested Butte's Transportation and Mobility Plan. I'm Mel Yema. I'm the Town of Crested Butte's long-range planner. I'm joined by Troy Russ, the town's community development director, Nick Katmer and Jenna Green, our transportation planning team, as well as Chrissy Fanganello, who I will introduce with her bio in just a few minutes. And she is our esteemed speaker today to talk all about, dude, where is my car? Let's talk about parking in livable communities. This webinar will run 1 hour. We'll wrap up right at noon. And it is being recorded, so feel free to share with your friends and family if you like what you hear. What we're going to do during this hour is we're going to kick off with a short kind of icebreaker, Mentimeter polling question, and then just a quick introduction of what is the transportation and mobility plan and what's the process for developing this plan. Then I will turn it over to Chrissy Fanganello for our wonderful presentation all about parking in livable communities. And then we'll move into a question and answer, and we'll have opportunities to type in questions as Chrissy is presenting or ask them in more of a discussion format over Zoom. And then we will wrap up right before 1 with just what's next, a call for our final webinar, and then a final call for our mobility survey as well. All right, so let's kick off with a quick icebreaker question. What we'd love for you to do is go to open a browser or on your computer or on your smartphone and go to this website at the top of the screen, www.menti.com. If you've been on our webinars before, hopefully you're familiar with this polling website, and then enter that code up there, 20024986. And we want to hear from you. Where do you usually park to go out to dinner in Crested Butte? Maybe you park in front of the restaurant. Maybe it's a trick question. You don't drive to dinner, you walk from your house, or you don't go out to dinner, but we just want to hear from you. Where do you usually park when you go out to dinner in Crested Butte? And by going to this website as well, you'll be able to type in questions that come up during Chrissy's presentation. So it'll come in handy for that as well. All right, so we're seeing people park at their house, and then also people park on Elk Avenue. Let's hear from where else. So we have 12 attendees so far, and at the bottom of the screen, we can see how many people have participated so far. So we're seeing park my bike in a nearby rack, park at the 4-way, the First and Elk parking lot, the transit center, the 4-way. We'll give about 20 to 30 more seconds. All right, so we're seeing quite a few responses for the 4-way, some responses for a side street or the First and Elk parking lot or on Elk Avenue or near the restaurant, as well as at home. So these are great responses. We are up to 12 and 12 attendees, so thank you. All right, let's move on and keep that browser open on Mentimeter because we will use that for the question and answer as well. So let's dive into a quick introduction of what is the Crested Butte Transportation and Mobility Plan. If you've been on our webinars before, you've already heard this, but hopefully last year you participated in or heard about the Crested Butte Community Compass, which is Crested Butte's comprehensive plan, and identified a 5-year strategic plan for the town of Crested Butte. In that strategic plan, we identified 7 goals to prioritize in the next 5 years. And one of those goals is to de-emphasize cars and focus on walking, biking, and transit. Within that goal, our first strategy to really start working towards that goal is to conduct a comprehensive re-examination of how people move throughout the town through a transportation master plan. So that's exactly what we're doing this year, of really looking at how we move within and around Crested Butte, and what are our opportunities and challenges for meeting that goal of de-emphasizing cars and focusing on walking, biking, and transit. So how are we going to develop this plan? We are in our first phase now, which we've really started internally since January, of data collection and plan preparation. We've been collecting a lot of amazing data and analysis from our different partners, like our transit agencies from CDOT, as well as we've been collecting speed and traffic volume data as well. And we've been combining that with a mobility survey that we've had running for the past month, and we have about 2 weeks of it left. So we're going to do a call for that at the end, where that's a community-wide survey to understand how do you move around Crested Butte. On top of data collection and analysis, we are running these introductory webinars to hear from national mobility experts on best practices and things to think about as we embark on this transportation and mobility plan. And then we're also recruiting participants to continue engaging in the next phases of the plan, which I'll talk about in just a second. And we will wrap up this first phase on Monday with a town council work session on Monday, April 3rd at 6 o'clock. That information is on the town's website if you'd like to join, where we're going to talk with our town council about their goals and expectations for this planning process. Up next, our next phase is going to start in May and June, where we're really going to dig into community outreach by identifying challenges and opportunities for mobility. We're going to start with a community open house on May 4th to present all that data we've collected and analyzed and hear from you on what are our biggest challenges, what are some ideas on mobility solutions. We're going to host a series of focus area workshops where we have a sign up on our website where you can reach out to sign up for different topics, from parking, like we're going to talk about today, to traffic circulation, to urban design, to walkability, bikeability. So if you're interested in attending a half-day workshop to really roll up your sleeves on a particular topic, please get in touch, as we'd love to recruit you for that. And then we will wrap up that next phase with a town council work session again to really go over what we learned when it comes to our challenges and opportunities. And then our third and final phase in the midsummer through the fall will be drafting the plan. So we will draft a plan based on all the information, data, feedback we've received. We will recruit an advisory committee from those workshops and from our technical partners and stakeholders to help us review and refine that plan. We'll have a community feedback period, and then we'll go through a series of presentations and refinements to hopefully have an adopted plan by November this year. So with that, that's what's to expect from our transportation and mobility planning process. And I'd love to turn it over now to Chrissy Fanganello to talk about Dude, Where's My Car? Parking in Livable Communities. We are so excited to have Chrissy here today. She has over 20 years of public and private sector transportation and urban planning experience. Her visionary leadership and commitment helped shift the intersection of transportation and city planning away from outcomes focused solely on vehicles to one focus on enhancing the lives of people. Her work has resulted in dozens of multimodal, equitable, and livable streets plans, including a US EPA technical assistance grant, an award-winning Vision Zero plan, and a final contender for Denver's U.S. Department of Transportation Smart City Challenge. Her experience helps bridge the interests of the public and private sector to collaborate on technical products, policy, and infrastructure solutions to meet a wide array of local, national, and global challenges related to climate change, sustainability, and equity. She served on the boards of the National Association of City Transportation Officials, Denver Regional Council of Governments, Denver Bike Share, WTS Colorado, and Denver's 2026 World Cup Bid Committee. She is the current vice chair for the City of Golden's Planning Commission, where she lives with her family. So thank you so much, Chrissy. I will turn it over to you, and keep that Menti up on your phone, because you can type in questions there for Chrissy as they come up in the presentation, and we'll get to them in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Mel. It's great to be here and be part of things happening in Crested Butte. I had the opportunity to do some work with you guys last year when you were working on the Compass community. So I'm pleased to be back for some more conversation with transportation and parking, which are dear to my heart. And that might seem like a weird thing to those of you that aren't transportation dorks, but that's what I call myself. It's a transportation dork. So, and I love Crested Butte. You guys, I think, are in one of the most amazing parts of our state and have the privilege of living in a wonderful community. So happy to chat with you guys. I wanted to just start with looking at some of the community values that you guys identified. And Mel already talked about these a little bit, but I think they're really important when we start thinking about this from a transportation and mobility perspective, because the things that you'll have in front of you, the choices that you'll need to make in order to shape the community for where you are today and where you want to be in the future, they're hard. And so I think for myself, it was important to just take a minute to think about these things, to think about your values and keep those in mind as I have the conversation. How do you maintain your authenticity as a community? How do you have that, maintain your accountability to the town, to each other, your connectedness? And I was most interested and excited to see bold as a community value, because it's, as I said at the beginning, like, this is hard work and the choices won't always be easy. And so reminding yourself of these values, I think, will be important, and encouraging yourself to maybe, make some choices that are bold when there are hard choices to be made. But I wanted to chat a little bit about, like, how do we get around? And this is true for Crested Butte, as it's true for most any place. As we get around town, we have the opportunity to walk or bike or take transit. But as much as those might be desires for us, either now or in the future to do more of, and I'd love, I wanted to include your goal that Mel already talked about, is de-emphasizing cars and focusing on walking, biking, and transit. It does not mean that even though we want those things to improve, it should be better, and for us to value them. It also means that driving and parking is still a reality for a lot of various reasons. And it's for different people too, whether they're employees that, work in the town, residents that live there, visitors that are coming. And then also thinking about who, like, taking that a layer down in terms of the users that we need to try to accommodate in terms of providing people mobility and access to the resources that are in the town and the facilities and the services. Not everyone is able to drive a vehicle on their own, and so that's something to take into consideration. And where we provide parking for folks is another important aspect of taking into consideration. And some things are required, like ADA parking, to provide folks that have either temporary or permanent mobility impairments the opportunity to park closer to where they're going, thinking about it from that perspective. Bike parking, we have, over time in the planning world, we've incentivized, like, hey, if you're carpooling, you might get a better parking spot, or if you're driving a compact car or an electric vehicle, you get a better parking space. And so how does this affect both how does the transportation system work and perform? What's the relationship to the land use, to the town, to our access to people and places and things? Because that's really what it's all about, is how do we get together to connect with one another and enjoy our time, whether that's work or school or getting services or what have you. These are how we get there. Is almost it can be as important as once you get there, but thinking about it from a town planning perspective, I think, is really important, because that interaction, sometimes our actions don't necessarily meet up with our sort of what we say our values are, where we're gonna want to be. So we often will say, in the work in transportation planning and urban planning and working with communities such as yours, folks will say, yes, we want something that's walkable and bikeable and transit friendly. But when we start talking about what does that actually look like and how that might affect parking in front of someone's home or business, then it starts to shift a little bit. And then people have said to me more times than I can count, well, oh, I really am a big fan of biking, but I want that bike facility to be, on the next block over. And so there's this inherent tension that's there. And I think it's a good thing. I think I like to call it healthy tension for us to grapple with a little bit. It makes the choices hard, but hopefully by working together and collaboratively, we can actually do a better job in terms of aligning on how we value our community and our transportation system and our land use collectively together. And may not always be like the outcome that we wanted personally, but if we can all live with it, I think that's a good place for us to land on. The challenge with parking, when we are doing that from a parking perspective and from a human behavior perspective, is that we often want to be in the same place at the same time. And we prefer convenient, free, and unlimited parking. And you guys know your town better than I do, but Third and Elk is by far sort of the epicenter of town where everyone wants to be. And obviously, if everyone drove there all the time in a vehicle, it would be a different place. It would have a different feel to it. And there's just not enough room for everybody, even in your small town, even with not a huge population. So how do we think about the resource? How do we identify parking as a resource? Because I want everyone to really be thinking about parking as a resource, and how do we use our resources mindfully, and think about the best way to take care of that. Now, in big cities, I used to work at the city of Denver for a long time. There was a desire at some point in time to like, well, let's not really talk about managing the asset, but let's look at it as a revenue source. And yes, parking can be a revenue source, but I would argue and have always argued that if you're going to charge for parking and get revenue, that's just like, icing on a cupcake. What you really want to do, the outcome and the goals that you're trying to accomplish, is to manage the parking, to manage the resource. I don't think it's a wise idea to think about parking as a revenue resource. Doesn't mean that it can't be, but again, let's think about the resource for the community and how best do we use that so that it meets our needs and goals and objectives of the town overall. And you guys obviously have something that is unique to Crested Butte, although California is trying to catch up with you from a normal year this year with the amount of snow that you have. And that affects the resource of parking in terms of what's available and how it can be used. So you have some unique situations and circumstances to take into account during different times of the year. But if we think about parking as an asset and something that we need to, take care of, we need to be thoughtful about what does it cost. So parking is really expensive. So these aren't costs that us as general people in the public will experience for the most part, unless you happen to be in real estate development. Then you might have a better idea of what it costs to build a parking space and to maintain a parking space. But it's a lot of money, $25,000 to $50,000 for one parking garage space, $10,000 for a surface parking space. And Jackson, Wyoming is another small, ski town like yourselves, has over 100,000 parking spaces, population that's quite a bit bigger than yours. But what it would take to replace those, and then how does that amount of parking sort of impact the place that you all are trying to have today and want to create into the future? Thinking about what does parking do from an affordability perspective for housing and for small businesses to be successful? How does your zoning requirements in terms of parking minimums, how does that affect what can be developed and what those costs are, that even if it, you might rent an apartment or buy a house and the price might be X dollars per month, or here's the total price if you're purchasing it, the cost of the parking is going to be rolled into that. It's not going to be something that is like, oh, it's, $1,000 a month for the rent and then another $300 a month for the parking space. That's not typically how folks will do that. So it gets a little bit covered up. It's sort of unseen. And I think it's important for us to be thoughtful and knowledgeable about that there really is a cost to parking, even if it's not explicitly identified in the transaction that you might be experiencing, because it is truly expensive for all of us to take on, not only from a cost perspective, but I think it's also important to think about what are the costs from a community perspective. The decisions that we make about parking and transportation impact and shape our community overall. So when we make decisions to say like, hey, we want parking in our community, and we do, we need to be mindful about the type of parking it is, the location of where that parking might be, and what are the opportunity costs of that parking, because we might actually have parking. We might want to do something different with parking. There might be a different land use that we want to have there. We might not, depending on how your code is written, sometimes it can inhibit the traditional development patterns that you guys have along Elk Avenue, which is so fantastic and so human scaled. And it's inviting to people as a place, whereas a parking lot by itself is not really a place for people. It serves a purpose, and we need parking, but it's not someplace typically, unless maybe you're my teenage daughter and you want to go hang out and skateboard in a parking lot. We're not usually hanging out in parking lots. They're not necessarily people places. So really being mindful about how and where we use parking to shape our community, and what the look and feel of the community is important. So as we've talked about the values of wanting things to be walkable and bikeable, being mindful about where and how we put parking is going to be important. And, I think even the on-street parking, which sometimes we take for granted, and many communities, including Crested Butte over the last few years through the pandemic, took the opportunity to use parking differently and have different kinds of spaces. And so making sure that we keep that in mind as we move forward, in terms of the decisions and the choices that you all have to make about the transportation system and the role that parking plays into it. One of my current colleagues likes to say that form follows parking. So depending on how much parking we require through our land use regulations and codes, or how we're thinking about the amount of parking we need, to support the land uses, the form will follow that. And so if we want a form similar to what you already have, be mindful of what your parking looks like today, and how that might shift if we shift the amount of parking that we have. Do you want your form to change as well? Because those are trade-offs that we might need to think about moving forward. When we talk about parking in terms of best management and the parking management toolbox, there are a lot of things that we can take into account. So, and many of these you guys have already started to work on. There's the demand for parking and how much supply you have. Obviously, those are going to be hand in hand in terms of what's available and how you're using it. Where is it located? Are there any sort of time restrictions, as well as pricing, the cost of parking? And all of these things influence both the way that we use parking as individual users of the transportation and mobility system, and it also affects, again, the way that the town looks and feels and responds to the transportation and mobility system. So let's run through those a little bit. Demand, let's talk about parking demand. It's the amount, if we think about demand, we can talk about it from a couple of ways, like how many people want to come into town and, drive their vehicle and park, to go to the restaurants, or to hit 4th of July, or enjoy, on their way to all the outdoor amenities or ski that you guys have to offer. And you guys are already talking about how do we reduce that demand by saying we want to be a walkable and bikeable community. So that's one way that we can be thinking about parking, is reduce the demand that we have. Thinking about the location of parking and how do we shift that demand, and sort of our mindset as well as human beings. As I showed you the bullseye on the map at the beginning. Like, I want to be right in front of my location. That's like our human nature. I want to go right to where I'm going. So how do we make the location actually in concert with the demand, shift our behavior and think about where is that parking supply? And some of that might be incentives, like in many communities, Golden, for example, just started doing paid parking along Clear Creek, which is a high attractor for tourists and people in town. And that's shifting the practices that people are doing. They're like, oh, well, I know if I go over here 3 blocks away to this off-street parking lot, I can park there for free, rather than deal with the congestion that's happening in and around the sort of the targeted area where people want to go. So thinking about demand and location of parking together is important. And then time. If we allow people to park all day long, sometimes that will work out really well, but sometimes that actually prohibits the amount of parking that's available for everybody. And so sometimes you want to just introduce the concept of time restrictions. It might be 2 hours, might be 3 hours, might be 4 hours in some instances and cases. It really depends on who you're trying to serve, who are your primary users of the parking spaces, who do you want to highlight. And it's not to say you're always going to have multiple users in any place, employees who may need to be someplace for, a 3, 4, 5, 6, or even 8-hour shift. Where are they going to be putting their vehicle during that time? And, we talk about Elk Avenue. If someone that works there drives up early in the morning to prepare for their day, and they take up that parking space their car might be there all day, which could result in frustration for customers or residents who are coming to Elk Avenue later in the day to run an errand or have lunch, but there's no parking available. But it's not because there isn't parking, it's the location of the parking. So thinking about how do we influence our behavior and our choices in terms of where and how we're going to park by introducing the element of time. And then pricing, we talked about a little bit. It can be a really effective tool in terms of influencing our behavior and reducing the amount of demand in high occupancy areas and creating more of a market for off-street parking, or just giving us that little nudge like, hey, I can park here for free, or I can park over there for $1. And so what is that? Just the psyche that sort of affects us as human beings and the choices that we're making. And even when pricing isn't something that you are interested in and willing to introduce, because I think it's something to be thoughtful about from an affordability perspective and an equity perspective, it's important to know that it's a tool in the toolbox that could be available to you someday in the future. And then the last one I wanted to talk about is supply. And oftentimes we talk about demand and supply together, but the supply of parking, and I've sort of indicated this on the bottom, as we go left to right across the screen, as you implement these different tools, the complexity goes up and often the cost will go up. And so thinking about supply is really the last thing that you want to be doing. You don't necessarily want to build a lot of parking just because you think you might need it. The ski season is going to be great this year, or there's a big event that happens, 4th of July, I know is big for Crested, Butte. You don't want to build for those one day or, 1 week of the year types of situations, because it would so negatively affect the overall authentic feel of the town. But you do need to be mindful of where your parking supply and resources are and when it might be necessary to think about introducing supply. So you guys have been fortunate to have some great staff on board that have already been thinking about these things. So I think it's great for just to take a look at this. Looking at some of the parking supply, this is data that the city provided me from the summer of 2020, and really kind of maps out where all the parking is in town. The yellow there is where there are private off-street spaces. So that might be spaces that are owned by individuals in your home or an apartment complex or what have you. And then there are all the public spaces that are available. And those are both on-street and off-street parking. So, almost 1,200 spaces available as of summer of 2020. Obviously, this is summer and you're not getting affected by snow and what have you. That certainly influences the amount of parking that's available. But it's pretty well spread out throughout the town. There's a fair amount of parking available, particularly considering the amount of full-time residents that you guys have there. Obviously, that is influenced by visitors and residents coming from other places and/or employees coming from other parts outside of the town proper. But here's what happens to parking when it's not managed in any way, shape, or form. Back to that bullseye that I shared at the beginning, everyone wants to be in the same place. And so we're not utilizing the amount of parking that's available as well as we could, because we're all trying to get to the same place. And this unfortunately results in many things, as people feeling frustrated that parking's not available, and having a sense that there just isn't enough, that it doesn't exist. And that can lead to all kinds of I'll say bad behavior, where people are driving around looking for a parking space that has climate implications in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases that are being released into the air. It could feel like, hey, we have more congestion in this part of downtown than we really want, and what's going on. So if we go back just really quickly, again, looking at the supply that you have available to yourself, there's more that's available that can be used. So using the resources, it really kind of gets back to that sustainability component. How do we use the resources we have wisely? When we start to look at the parking supply versus the demand in terms of what was happening, the supply, the blue line there's plenty of supply you can see throughout the daytime. The only time we start seeing that it hits what we call the 85th percentile, and that's the point at which people will feel like it's really difficult to find a parking space and can start to raise some frustrations about where parking availability is. It only is not happening for a small amount of the time during the day. So how can you do a better job of utilizing the amount of parking that's available and reducing that, hitting that 85th percentile where people are starting to feel frustrated and looking for different solutions, and or calling staff and saying, hey, we really need some more parking. How do we think about this differently? And so you're really, I think, fortunate that your staff put together this parking management plan and started to implement thinking about parking. And will spread out the amount of demand that we have on parking over time and over the course of both over the course of the day, as well as over the course of the overall area of the town, with the 2-hour parking restrictions that are put into place in the different parts of the area. And what that resulted in, remember where we had all the red before, is the parking utilization really got spread out. So there's a lot more parking available throughout the community. The resource of parking is being used in a much more equitable fashion throughout town. And I think it probably results in much more, climate friendly, walkable friendly community for the town people overall, and for visitors and employees as well. So again, we've got this resource opportunity, and really an important aspect to be thinking about. How do we use the resource we have available to ourselves from a parking perspective, and not allowing parking to just to take over. I think that could be, unfortunately, an easy reaction, and for folks to not take into account the shape and the land uses and the space and the place that you want the town to be, both now and in the future. And again, not letting the amount of parking dictate how the form of your town is going to be, either now or in the future as well. So the tools that you guys are working on already, we've already got many of them that are being taken into consideration that you're working on. Pricing, as I said, it may not be something that you're interested from a equitable and affordability perspective. But again, know that it's a tool that you can have in the pocket to take into consideration moving forward when and if needed. And then from that supply perspective, being really mindful about where and how and when parking is going to be required, either through the development process, and how does that affect the look and feel of places over time. Elk Avenue is so lovely with the on-street parking. There's not a lot of surface parking that you might see in bigger cities, on the Front Range here, where we've got multiple urban arterials that have a lot of parking that's adjacent to the street, that doesn't really acknowledge us as human beings and frame the space overall to kind of create that look and feel that you already have in Crested Butte. You want to make sure that you're protecting that moving forward. So being mindful of how and where you put the parking in the future will be important. And then I think it's also important to be thoughtful about what are some of the metrics and the outcomes, and how do we talk about that? So, the town has already collected some of the data with regards to where is parking available and how is it being used. Making sure that you're thinking about the data and the information and what's available right now, or what you might want to have available, to really understand, like, are you meeting the goals and the outcomes? What's been set so far in the community compass strategic plan, what will come out of this transportation and mobility plan, and really take the opportunity to say, like, let's define what good looks like for Crested Butte. Like, what's the unique context that's happening here? What do we like today? What do we not like today? And how do we have the opportunity to shift that over time and really measure what's working and what's not? You can shift policies and practices, like the pilot that was done over the last couple of years, to see what works and what doesn't work, and gives us as human beings sort of the opportunity to experience it. What does that change look like, rather than just simply changing something up front, not knowing how it might actually impact the town and the community and the feel overall. And it gives us the opportunity to gather insights from people. And then I think there's also opportunities for strategic investment. What kind of investments have we made in the past? and what kind of outcome is that getting us, and are they aligned, and really being honest and thoughtful about whether it's working or not working. Because it's really up to you all in your unique context and what you're trying to achieve from that outcome perspective. How much more do we want to organize parking or provide additional parking, or just manage what we have and provide different mobility options, whether that's for biking or additional transit options to help people move around further? How does that, what's the role that the town plays with the broader community, you know, with the mountain and with South Crested Butte and Gunnison, even all of these things take into consideration. And it's not a, you know, one after another necessarily. It really is an iterative process. So, you know, setting those metrics and saying, hey, we really wanted to accomplish, you know, parking at a certain level for the downtown area, and here's what we did to try to do that, and was it successful or not, and having those honest conversations with the community about what worked or what didn't work, and then being willing and able to make those changes when they need to be shifted and changed. And sometimes, you know, one of the questions I've asked communities that I worked for previously, or worked with as a consultant previously, is the outcomes that we set for ourselves. Sometimes the question needs to be asked, like, hey, we set out a walkability or a bikeability goal. Oftentimes in communities that will be by a certain percentage of trips should be that, or our mode share should be, you know, 50% walking or 50% biking, things of that nature. And sometimes, and we may not get there, and it doesn't mean that not reaching the goal, the intended goal, makes it a bad goal. But I do think that it's important for us to acknowledge, like, what's preventing us from making more progress on that goal? Are there things that we can or should shift in terms of our practices and policies, or our investments that we're doing that? Or do we need to maybe change the goal? Maybe we were too aspirational, too visionary in terms of what we were trying to accomplish, and we've actually swung the other way and said we actually like parking and we want more of it. I don't know that that's going to be the case here, but I do think it's important to have those honest conversations and allow the healthy tension and conversation to be part of this process that you guys are in with the transportation and mobility plan development. Again, we won't ever be able to make everybody happy, but if we can find those places where people can find that we can live with the situation in terms of where we are and what we're trying to accomplish, I think that actually makes for really good conversation, both with the community and moving forward in terms of making some of those harder decisions about what changes we might need to make moving forward. So a livable community, I just wanted to end with, again, going back to your 4 goals with the authenticity and connectedness and accountability and the bold. And in particular, I wanted to call back attention to, with regards to being bold, we may need to consider graceful acknowledgement that success does not come from learning without failures. So I think that the guidance you guys have put together already with regards to the community compass and the strategies that you have really puts you in a good space to be thinking about the resource of parking and how it plays into the overall transportation and mobility system, how the transportation system works, and how it supports the community and the land use overall. Those are, you can't, as much as we might want to say we can bifurcate the land use and the transportation system and the parking from one another, it's an interwoven, complex space that, again, requires that healthy tension to be thoughtful about what do we want from our streets, what do we want from our town, how do we want the feel, the look, and the overall vibe of our community to be. And we won't always be able to do that easily without having some challenging conversations. But I so appreciate the way that you are moving forward so far with the desire to be authentic and to be really grounded in place, and being willing to take some of the chances that you might need to take in order to move forward with regards to transportation and mobility in terms of where we are today and what you want it to be in the future as well. So with that, I've introduced some new concepts to everybody, or maybe some old concepts that you've talked about previously, but I'm really thrilled to be part of the conversation and have some additional time to do question and answer and talk through some additional best practices if there's any.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chrissy. I'm going to go ahead and re-share the screen to remind you of the Menti code, to add in your questions or comments for Chrissy, but also feel free to hit that raise hand button if you want to start off with a question. So far, Chrissy, we have a comment in here that came in right before you talked about our pilot parking management program, about how timing on elk could be a good option, but it does require personnel and could bring more cars onto side streets. And I could hit on that comment really quickly, in that when we started this pilot parking management program, we initially really just wanted to start with the timing on elk. We weren't ready to jump to paid parking. We wanted to really think about how can we better move around parking where everyone wanted to park at first in elk. And we thought, let's start with timing. But we knew if we just started with that, we really wanted to couple it with that permit parking program in the side streets. So as that map showed from that summer parking study, it really did help spread out parking. But going back to kind of the different metrics that Chrissy was talking about, we can't just measure the program based on utilization, where we really found through the rollout of that program that small town feel and vibe was really important as well. So it led us to being bold and going back and making tweaks with the program, to allowing 2-hour parking in the side streets, to making sure all the permits were free and homeowners could have as many permits as they wanted. So we've really been actively tweaking that parking management program. And as we go on through this transportation plan, it'll be a really great time for our community to see how has this been working, and what sort of additional tweaks do we want to make in the longer term as well. So I see another question popping up here, Chrissy. Have you seen success with communities that stay with free managed parking and never go to pay parking? And as a quick side note, so our parking management program is free, and the first year violations did cover the cost of the program, but now with kind of making those adjustments and really wanting to have our small town feel, it's not a profitable program, and the town is really subsidizing that program. So cost is definitely something that has to be part of the conversation. And Chrissy, what examples have you seen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting to see. There's, I'm in Golden, and I've had the opportunity to work in other small communities, not quite as small as Crested Butte necessarily, but it is a bit of a challenge. And so, as Mel was kind of pointing to, it's not to say that there aren't administrative costs that go with this, but it's the choices that the community wants to make. Some communities make choices with regards to how they want parking to feel, and they're willing to absorb those costs. Other communities are willing to go ahead and say, hey, we're going to charge for parking so that we can at least cover those costs, but their priority is more on, this will sound funny for you guys, because I was going to talk about snow removal. But snow removal is something that, is a bigger budget in other places. And so I think it's important for everyone overall to think about, again, the outcomes that you're trying to accomplish, and then how are the resources that you have available to yourselves, in terms of what's coming into the general fund, and how is the general fund being spent over time. And are those expenditures really aligning with the outcomes, meeting those needs? And I think that's often where never going to pay parking is probably a bit of a challenge, because there's typically, in any town or city, there are more demands on the limited general fund than there is available. And so looking for those opportunities is going to be challenging. And it does take a lot to manage that parking, to keep it at that level where it feels like parking is available. And there are opportunities, potential implications with regards to growth and development. So I would say it's important to keep all of those things in mind. I can't think of a small community that I've worked in that hasn't gone to any paid parking. Not to say they don't exist, but I can't think of one off the top of my head.
So thank you, Chrissy. We have some more great questions lined up. Let's go into, can you talk about the relationship between parking supply and convenience, and mode shift away from cars?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that is one of our biggest challenges, really in North America and probably in the western half of the United States in particular, because of our development patterns, and our reliance on vehicles. And so we have made it really easy to take vehicles, as our primary mode of transportation. And so much of, less so in a town like Crested Butte, but so much of what we have in our communities in North America, in the West, has been built around the car. And you guys have such a lovely downtown and great structure that you can build upon and say, like, hey, if this is what we value, then this is what it's going to take for us to preserve it. And that might mean, again, like making different choices with regards to how, the dollars that are available are being spent. Does it make more sense to invest more in a transit system? Because what I have experienced in my career working on transportation and land use is people are willing to use transit when it's easy and convenient. It's just usually not in North America. And so how do we make transit easy and convenient enough that it's actually the easier choice for me to make than it is for me to get in my car? And I live, as I said, in Golden. I'm just a few blocks from downtown. I almost never drive, and everyone's like, "Oh, well, do you ride your bike?" I'm like, actually, I don't even ride my bike. I walk everywhere because it's more trouble to go and get my bike out than it is to just walk out the door and walk. So making sure we have those options, and again, thinking about how do we define the convenience and make that convenience available? Again, you guys have a unique situation sometimes in the winter, well, not sometimes in the winter with the snow, that might actually have some influences there. And so maybe there are some specific things you would do during the winter time to make transit more convenient, in different seasons from a seasonal perspective.
Definitely. Thank you, Chrissy. Let's take a quick break from the Mentimeter. We have a hand up from Gabi, one of our council members.
Yeah.
Gabi, if you're able to unmute yourself, you should be able to ask your question. Are you there, Gabi? Well, let's see. As she's getting settled, let's go into one more question from the screen and then come back.
Okay.
So Crescent Butte, a lot of residents and visitors have lots of toys like trailers, snow, sleds, snowmobiles, rafts. How do you think, or what are ways to manage those types of space requirements?
Yeah, you definitely have some unique challenges there for sure. A lot of cities and towns will put together some regulations that will limit the amount of time that those could be parked in the street. Often it's, a 72-hour rule. So you have the ability to sort of bring those forward and get them ready and prepare them, or, break them down when you're done using the toys, but there aren't necessarily the ability to keep them there all the time. That also still means that there still needs to be some area where there's storage spaces. And so they're not necessarily easy answers, but thinking about what is that going to take? Again, I think there's a seasonal aspect in terms of what Crested Butte has to deal with. And as also pointed out, it will be different for residents than it is for folks that are coming in and visiting into the neighborhood. But I think most important is, to let sort of the outcomes and the values that you guys are taking into consideration, let those be your driver in terms of how you're going to make those choices, which won't necessarily be easy. But if walking and biking is something that you want to value and transit throughout the year, then what are the implications of those vehicles being stored? If they're blocking the availability for people to move around, it's one of those situations where I think it's important to think about the greater good and how do we all contribute to that greater good, even if it may mean that I have to make an unpopular, but a personally unpopular decision is, oh, hey, I've got to move my snowmobile and I've got to pay for storage somewhere off season when I'm not using it. So again, but let those values really be some of the driver, and then we can work into some of the management of the space overall and how that kind of plays into the storage and the functionality of the transportation system.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chrissy. Gabi, I see you're unmuted now. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Chrissy. My question, can you expand a little bit on when you were talking about parking lots, you said, sometimes they're actually, it's counterintuitive, but it's less walkable with a lot. And I guess I'm thinking about our community is there are an awful lot of people who drive in from CB South who would love to walk and bike in town, but
Yeah.
the parking is a constraint for them. And so I guess I'm just um, wondering if there would be situations in which a parking lot, sort of separate, would actually be able to enhance walkability and bikeability. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. I think that the design and location of parking lots can really make a difference. So what I think when I was talking about parking, not making things walkable, is more about the placement of the parking. So like you wouldn't want to have a surface parking lot fronting Elk Avenue. Like that wouldn't make a very walkable down, town center. And so thinking about it from that perspective is, in terms of location, I think is important. But I also think that the design of a parking lot, the interior design of a parking lot, is important as well. And I don't know that as land use planners and designers that we pay enough attention to that. And so there can be code requirements with regards to planting. There can be code requirements with regards to the pedestrian circulation in addition to the vehicular circulation. And then the co-location, I think, of transportation and mobility is important. Is there, can a transit shuttle or something along those lines do a stop at that if it's a little bit outlying in terms of where people are wanting to go to and go from, so that they provide that better service and making, again, that increasing the convenience overall. I know there's a lot of bikes around town. I don't know that there is a bike share necessarily, but that's something that the city of Golden played around with a little bit, having our own bike share. And is that something that could sort of help as visitors are coming in from other places to have something that's available, whether it's a shuttle or, easy access to walking or to bikes that can be shared, to reduce the amount of time that we spend in our vehicles kind of circling, looking for parking and just polluting the community as well.
Thank you for that question, Gabby, and thanks, Chrissy. Building off the topic of kind of surface parking, there's an observation about how on-street parking could take away from the pedestrian feel of a street like Elk Avenue. And we did hear some observations during our parklet program with the outdoor dining on Elk of like, without so many parked cars, of wow, I can actually see the buildings. But is there, like, it kind of seems like there's one or the other. Our parking lot's evil, on-street parking's great. Like, can you talk about that balance?
Yeah, I mean, there's no perfect way of doing it, and there are no silver bullets, unfortunately. So I really appreciate that you guys were one of the brave communities to try some things and do something different during the pandemic. And I think it's not just is it parking or not parking, but it's also like, how can you design the street, so to speak? And that doesn't necessarily have to be hard capital design, physical infrastructure design. It can be, things that are much more, I'll use whimsical as a word, and that can be moved, whether that's planters or what have you, and sort of setting that tone overall, which I know you guys have done a little bit already in terms of, slowing down the traffic and creating that space, designing the space a little bit differently so that we operate differently there, whether I'm walking or biking or driving. We need those visual cues from our environment and from our, the other people that are out on the street or, going into and out of the buildings. That's going to be important, just as the location of the buildings are. So, I mean, I kind of think about a street like Elk Avenue as the living room. And so how do we want to set up the living room? How do we want to design the living room to say, like, and be really clear with the community too, like how we're prioritizing. So if Elk Avenue is the living room, and we really want to prioritize the living room for us to, as human beings, to be comfortable, then we might set it up a certain way. If we wanted to prioritize it differently from a vehicular access perspective, then we might set it up differently. But oftentimes I think most communities are going to try to find a blend of how do you provide some ability for vehicular access as well as the human being centered component. And that's I think where it gets tricky, because you really, again, you've got to have those physical cues and design elements that will help us behave the way that we want each other to behave, sort of respectfully in that living room space.
That's a great analogy. I love that. As a kind of really specific follow-up when it comes to on-street parking, should we consider using on-street parking for bike parking in addition to cars?
You know, so I think personally, I think it's a great idea, because you can park so many bikes in those spaces. You know, I don't know. I don't know. I'm just going to say maybe you could park a dozen bikes, probably more, in one vehicular parking space. And it's been shown, you know, time and time again in communities in many different places, different sizes, that it actually contributes to the economic development and vitality of a space. It again is giving those cues from a behavioral standpoint of how should I operate, whether I'm walking or driving, because I've got to be more mindful and careful of people using those spaces. It brings a certain level of vitality, I think, to the street, because it's bringing more people into the area. So I really like the idea of using bike parking spaces. It is one of the things that we've been talking about locally in Golden. I think I mentioned it earlier, like part of the reason I walk everywhere is because it's easier. Part of the reason it's easier is because there aren't any places for me to securely park my bike. And, you know, maybe less of an issue there, so the security component. But I think a lot of times often people feel, especially if they've not knowing the fancy bikes that people buy, like they want to have that secure facility to lock their bike up into. And I think that there's a lot of data that you can find in reports that have been done. NACTO is a great resource in terms of how it's actually been a positive, not only from a look and feel space, but also from that economic development return on investment too.
Thanks, Chrissy. Let's go into our kind of final wrap-up question, but can you talk about what you think would happen if we lowered our parking requirements?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough question, I think. There's a couple of things to think about this, and I'll start with it from a historical perspective. So, because I think that there is oftentimes a sense that there's a right number. And so I'm going to say right with air quotes for those of you that can see me. But historically, the numbers were derived, you know, and there was a formula that we've used to derive these numbers and say like, oh, this amount of land use is going to require this amount of parking. And it will sound like it is scientific, and you can look it up in a book and it'll say, you know, 1,000 square feet of this means you need this many parking spaces. I think the challenge with that approach, it's a very North American approach. It's a very vehicular oriented approach. And I also don't know that there's any accuracy behind the numbers. It's just it's a practice. And we've been using these numbers and this practice and approach for such a long time that it has become accepted as right. I think more importantly, it is for you all, or for any town, any community to say, what do I want my town, my community to feel like? How do I want to define success? And parking is a component of that. The land use, the look and feel of the land use, the form of the land use is also an important component of that. And what do we want the driver to be? So requiring too much parking can really very quickly and negatively affect the overall look and feel of a place or sense of place at all. My work over my career in transportation, I have always come at things with a people-centered perspective. Is, you know, you can draw a pretty picture as an urban designer or a landscape architect. What I would ask the question was, what's it going to feel like when I'm there, standing on the corner? Can I imagine myself there? Does it feel like it's going to be enjoyable? Will it give me joy to be there? Will I feel honored as a human being? And our relationship to vehicles and parking spaces, I think, can get really quickly just really kind of bifurcated from our sense of selves and our sense of connectedness to others from the rest of us that are human, in our community members. And so I think that's something to be thoughtful about, is where do your values kind of point you to from that perspective, and what are those implications? And there's, as I mentioned early on, the economic components to parking are huge. So thinking about, like, if I want to build more affordable housing in the community, and one of the ways to help with that, it doesn't solve all the problems, but one of the intersectional components is to reduce the amount of parking that's required. Does it help me meet some of those outcomes that I'm trying to achieve? Yes. Does it mean that there won't be other opportunities or challenges that come up from that, with regards to maybe having to increase the amount of parking management that we're doing? It might spread, from 2 blocks to 6 blocks to, 12 blocks or whatever it might be. Yes, those are all trade-offs for us to take into consideration. But from my perspective and my professional experience, I think we, as a culture in the United States of America, have historically required far too much parking and far too much reliance on vehicles as our sole way of moving around, and that we really do have the opportunity as communities, as people, to say, I want to choose something different for myself and for my neighborhood and for my community, and I'm willing to put in the work and the effort that it's going to take to manage the transportation system differently, to move differently, and to understand what those parking implications are going to be, and are the trade-offs worth it? And in my mind, I would say yes. But those are for the trade-offs for you guys to really think through. Is there going to be Carmageddon at the end of the day if you lower your parking requirements? No, I don't think there would be at all. I think there would be a lot of, sorry, I've got an active dog now, positive benefits. She thinks that's a good idea too.
Well, thank you, Chrissy. That's such a great wrap up. Let's all give a big round of applause from our Zoom boxes for Chrissy and her adorable dog. We are just a minute over 1 o'clock, but just as a quick wrap up, we have one more webinar coming up next week with Carlos Hernandez, all about transit. So please sign up if you haven't yet. The recording of today's webinar will be posted on the Transportation Plan website this afternoon. So please share it with your friends and your colleagues. And then if you're really interested in diving further into talking about parking and all these different types of ideas, please send us an email at transportation@crested-butte.co.gov to sign up for that workshop in phase 2. Lastly, if you have not taken our mobility survey yet, please take it. It gives us such helpful data of how you move around Crested Butte. We have 300 responses so far, which is fantastic, but we want more. So please send that survey out to your friends. Please take it. And feel free to get in touch with any other questions. So let's give a big round of applause for Chrissy. Thank you so much for being here, talking all about Dude, Where's My Car? And I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Mel. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.